On behalf of the Aspen Institute, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Tony Verstandig, Chair of the Middle East Program here at the Aspen Institute. And I'm pleased to introduce our Eboo Patel, who is founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps and a member, I am pleased and very proud to say, of our Partners for New Beginnings Steering Committee. And of course, my colleague and boss, Elliot Gerson, who is Vice President for Policy and Public Programs here at the Aspen Institute. I would like to take this opportunity to also tell you a little bit about Eboo's work here with us on behalf of Partners for New Beginning. And it's appropriate, I think, as a backdrop, and I know my colleague Meryl Chertoff, in the spirit of collaboration here at the Aspen Institute, will also share with you her interface and involvement with Eboo. It's no surprise to any of you, we all cherish the time that we have and engagement with Eboo. But Partners for New Beginning was formed as an outgrowth of President Obama's Cairo speech, and it is meant to be a new call to action and a new beginning between America and the Muslim world. PNB has proven to be a very interesting undertaking. It's chaired by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Walter Isaacson, our President and CEO here at the Aspen Institute, and Mukhtar Kent, and a very distinguished steering committee, which I said Eboo is here and very, very engaged with us. We have managed to establish in a very short period of time, a little over a year and a half, 10 local chapters ranging from Morocco to Indonesia and Pakistan. Those local chapters are very much a philosophy, embrace a philosophy of locally owned and locally driven. And they have helped embed and enhance our partnership, and also it's tethered with action on the ground. So Eboo and Elliot, I welcome you, Eboo, to the Aspen Institute, and Elliot, I turn the microphone over to you to help moderate, but I don't know if Meryl would like to say a few words before we begin our book conversation.
Sure. Hi, I'm Meryl Chertoff, Director of the Justice and Society Program here at the Aspen Institute. The Justice and Society Program runs programs each summer out in Aspen, but we also are engaged on rule of law issues around the world and here in the United States. It's about a year and a half ago now, Eboo and I had a conversation about what we could do to help to amplify the message of the Interfaith Youth Corps and the important work that was being done by Eboo and his group and by other groups around the country on religious pluralism. In March of last year, we had a conference called Inclusive America, and we brought together a group of people from a variety of sectors to talk about what could be done to bring that message of religious pluralism and generalize it around the country. The response was so enthusiastic that we have formed a distinguished panel, which we're very privileged to have directed by or headed by Madeleine Albright and David Gergen. Our first meeting will be on December 17th. The panel will consider and report back on strategies to advance religious pluralism. It will produce a white paper, and we hope that we will be able to bring some of the best practices represented by organizations like Interfaith Youth Corps and others, some of which I think are in the room here today, that will provide a template for going forward to improve relations between religious groups, to encourage the better view of religious groups generally in America, and to provide a site for dialogue and a path forward. I'm delighted to have our friend Eboo here again today, and to hear about what he has to say about the book.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Meryl. Thank you all for being here today. I'm particularly excited about being able to have this conversation, as I've known Eboo for, we were just shocked to think about it, 15 years. And it's really wonderful to see someone, and I got to know him when he was a passionate college senior, committed to making a huge difference in the world. And it really is refreshing, exciting, and I'm proud to see that 15 years later he is he still has that same passion. He's still engaged in the same kinds of activities. He's someone who could have done almost anything else and could have become fabulously rich or many other different kinds of things. And, but if you buy his book, though, it will help. Actually, also, we were just joking beforehand, talking about what I might like to talk to him about before I open it up to all of you. And he realized that I'd actually read his book, which apparently is unusual for people moderating discussions with authors, which is a scary thought. But I do very strongly recommend the book, because the book is about many, many things. It's really about America. American history and American values. It's not a book about why anti-Muslim prejudice is a bad thing, as bad as it is. It is a book about our values, and it's a book about tolerance in general, and it's one that I very strongly recommend. The format here is a little different from most of our sort of book talk kinds of conversations where we'd be sitting in chairs next to each other, so you'll excuse me, especially Eboo, and that I will, especially with a microphone too, be directing some of my questions, looking at the audience and not just engaging with you. I don't think that would work as well with us in a round table like this. But the book begins, I think, appropriately, really at ground zero and the fate of Cordoba House. Of course, Cordoba House was named for Cordoba in Spain, where from the roughly 8th to 11th century, I guess, there was a both, literal, there was a literal brilliant flowering of multi-religious, tolerant civilization of a kind that, frankly, the world had never seen before and arguably has never seen since in terms of the multiplicity of religions and values that were represented. And I wonder how, the fate of Cordoba House itself, now called Park 51, is a metaphor for the problem of religious prejudice in America.
Right. So thank you, Elliot and Tony and Meryl. Let me just say, I was that geeky kid who, like at 18, instead of wanting to become a rock star or play for the Chicago Bulls, I wanted to speak at the Aspen Institute. So dream come true, geekiness, promise fulfilled. But thank you for the invitation, and thank you for taking the work of building American pluralism and international bridges as seriously as you do. I'm proud to be involved with each of you individually in the Aspen Institute as a platform more broadly. So I think Cordoba House, better known as the Ground Zero Mosque and also known as Park 51, that gives you a sense of its multiple personalities, I guess, is a metaphor in a number of ways. And I think maybe the most important and frankly least talked about is that it was the first American Muslim project of any national scale that was meant to be publicly oriented instead of community facing. Which is to say, over the course of the last 40 years or so, since Muslims have been in this country in any appreciable numbers, right? There's a significant African-American Muslim population, perhaps 20 to 25% of American Islam. And then after 1965 and the Immigration Act is when you started to get appreciable numbers of immigrant Muslims. Most of the institution building has naturally been community-faced. It's been mosques, it's been Jamaat khanas, it's been Muslim schools. It's been places where Muslims can get married and buried, right? The kinds of things that you need to be able to practice your faith in this society. But I think the great genius of America, and if there's one theme in the next hour of at least my remarks, it's going to be this, is that the American promise is to grant dignity to a variety of identities and communities. But the American genius is that those identities and communities can then plant their inspiration on American soil and build institutions that serve the broader public. And you can talk about literally thousands of Catholic, Jewish, Lutheran, Quaker institutions of that variety, right? This was the first Muslim project of any national scale that was not meant primarily to serve Muslims. It was meant to express Muslim identity in a way that served the broader public, in this case, the lower Manhattan community. So I think it was, in that case, it was, in that way, it was a metaphor for a coming of age of American Muslims. And I think that part of coming of age as a community in America is you build institutions not primarily for yourself, but primarily for others. I think the second, of course, metaphor here was the name Cordoba House, which is drawing on, Elliot, as you referenced, a period in Muslim civilization that many Muslims are proud of because of its dimensions of tolerance and pluralism. Like anything, it's mixed. But the general view of historians on the 8th to the 11th century in southern Spain, of which Cordoba was the main city, is that it was a civilization that welcomed, in that case, different types of Muslims and Jews and Christians, and built a generally tolerant civilization. And what Imam Faisal and Daisy Khan, the visionaries behind Cordoba House, had long viewed was that that ought to be the strain of Islam we seek to lift up and then build on here in America. And America is actually an advancement, a significant advancement, frankly, on Cordoba, as anything 1,000 years later would be. A participatory politics, a civil society that welcomes the contributions of multiple communities, et cetera. And then, of course, the final metaphor is what happened to it, which is amongst the most...
It didn't proceed as Mayor Bloomberg hoped it would.
That's right, let's say. I mean, my first concern about Cordoba House when I heard about it was, oh my gosh, it's going to have a swimming pool, right? And Imam Faisal, right? Imam Faisal is a wonderful a man that I love and admire deeply, and is known as on the liberal side of American Islam, even American Islam. So the idea of a swimming pool in a community that has orthodox views of gender relations, and then the questions of who is going to be able to swim there at one point, et cetera, that's what I thought was going to give it the most trouble, if only, right? It becomes, as everybody knows, kind of the focal point of, on the one hand, I think the focal point of three things. Number one, serious, real, and totally understandable questions about what is happening to that deeply sensitive and important area of America 10 years after 9/11. Entirely understandable set of concerns. Second, an understandable set of, what I think is an understandable set of conditions around Muslims. If what you know about Islam is what you watch on the evening news, which is what many Americans know about Islam, I think having a question about who this community is makes some sense. And then the third thing is, it became the focal point of what I call the industry of Islamophobia, which is because of the presence of those first two things, the set of questions that people reasonably have around what's happening in the immediate vicinity of Ground Zero. Second, the questions that people have about who Muslims are, an industry of Islamophobia, which I detail quite colorfully in this book, uses that as an opportunity to effectively say that the Osama bin Laden version of Islam is indeed true Islam, and Cordoba House is going to be the center in which it is perpetrated on American soil.
Well, let's just continue on that third metaphor. One of the things that was said by someone, and we'll talk about him, was that it was like putting a Nazi sign next to the Holocaust Museum. The person who said that was Newt Gingrich. And Newt Gingrich figures prominently in this book, and in two dramatically different ways. Initially, almost as a hero to Muslim staffers on Capitol Hill.
Right.
What happened?
So, in Sacred Ground, I detail two figures. One is Michael Bloomberg, who I think is the American hero of the moment, who comes to the aid of Cordoba House in its most robust dimensions, meaning not just we have to allow this to happen because of freedom of religion and what I call hiding behind the Constitution. He says, I want this to happen. This is going to be a significant asset to Lower Manhattan. I have trust and belief in Imam Faisal. And again, at the most robust dimensions, Mayor Bloomberg supports this. And Newt Gingrich is the guy who takes every opportunity to say that this is going to be a terrorist command center. And what's deeply ironic about that is that in the late 1990s, a set of Muslim staffers on Capitol Hill, Republican staffers, one of them is a friend of mine, Suhail Khan, I think he still lives here in D.C., approached the Speaker of the House, who controls the space on the House side of the Capitol, and asks for a place for Muslim prayer on Fridays. And he thinks it's going to take him a year to get this. It's going to be a long process, and maybe they'll finally get it on a monthly basis instead of, for the weekly Friday Jummah. and he approaches Speaker Gingrich at a cocktail party and, basically explains what he needs in 3 minutes, assuming that he's going to have multiple meetings with multiple DC heavyweights to actually make this happen. And Gingrich says, as long as I'm Speaker, you will have a place for 50 Muslims to pray, and I'll make sure that the House staff sets the room up the way that you want to. This is in 97, 98, okay? 13 years later, Gingrich is the tip of the spear. I think Politico calls him the leading voice for Islamophobia in America, saying things like there aren't just violent jihadists, there are silent jihadists, and those silent jihadists are present amongst us, and any acquiescence to Sharia law, including having banks in America or doing business with banks that have Sharia compliant financing, et cetera. All of this is allowing the jihadist movement to emerge in America. Gingrich is one of the only people in the Republican presidential campaign who speaks about the danger of Muslims on the primary campaign trail, right?
Why the change?
So it's entirely political expedience. And one of the reasons I want to point to Gingrich is because here's a guy who knew better. And part of what I want to point to in this book is that it's the industry of Islamophobia is not just people who don't know better. It is, in fact, people who do know better and who are perfectly willing to trample on 3 to 6 million American Muslims on the way to what amounts to a failed presidential bid. I want to say one quick thing here is that, I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I am aware of the atmosphere in America around identity in a way that I, haven't been since I was 14 years old. There are, when leading national figures go out and say, Muslims are dangerous, your Muslim neighbor is a silent jihadist, what that means is 10-year-old Muslim kids get beaten up in schools, right? It's not just an opportunity to run for president. It's something that poisons a civil society, and I just think that we ought to be against it to the ends of our American teeth, if you will.
Let's go back to reactions to the proposals for Cordoba House. There were Muslim voices against it too, weren't there? And talk to us about that.
So, I just reread Tariq Ramadan's Washington Post op-ed in which, and I think that his was kind of illustrative of this, is there were basically people who said, let's not pick this fight now, right? So they weren't against Cordoba House on the merits of it. They said that this isn't good for American Muslims now. And I'm generally somebody who says be very prudent about the fights that you choose. But when, you're on a bus in 1955 sitting where you want to and somebody puts cuffs on you, you didn't choose that fight. You just sat where you wanted to on the bus, right? So in my view, this wasn't a fight that Imam Faisal or Daisy Khan or Sharif al-Gamal chose. They wanted to build what amounted to a Muslim YMCA a few blocks from where Imam Faisal had his mosque, which is to say he had a presence in that neighborhood for 25 years. And I think to have, as Bloomberg put it, to have shied away from the fight that other people brought to them would have effectively said, hey, you all can decide where people build their mosques, or you all can decide, anybody can decide when the Muslim community has come of age in America and is able to build institutions that serve the broader public. So I think the Muslim concerns about this were not on the merits of it. It was on the sense of let's not pick this fight. And I just think that there are important moments in history where engaging the opposition matters, and I think that this was one of them.
One of the things that I thought was wonderful about the book is the history. I mean, there's a lot of American history about principles of tolerance and respect, and the opposite. You go back to even mention, I didn't realize Peter Stuyvesant in New York in the mid-17th century banned Quaker meetings or something like that, and then you continue historically. One of the most interesting historical parallels that you develop is between what you see today and anti-Catholic sentiments, especially those that were quite virulent 50 years ago when a Catholic was running for president. And it's interesting if you look back at the rhetoric 50 years ago, and then you just replace Catholic with Muslim, or you replace church hierarchy or the Pope
Right.
with Sharia law. It's really quite dramatic.
You could literally replace the words that Pam Geller or Robert Spencer or Newt Gingrich were using about Muslims, as you say, with what people said about Catholics. And one of the fascinating ironies of Mr. Gingrich during this time is that he was converting to Catholicism, or had just completed a conversion to Catholicism at the same time as he was saying these things. And one of the lines in the book is that there are people who, when Bloomberg had an experience of anti-Semitism as a kid and made a decision that this will never happen to anybody ever again. Right? It's not just about Jews. He decided it's about prejudice, and prejudice is wrong, whoever it targets. Gingrich has, as a historian, has a sense of anti-Catholic prejudice in America, and instead of identifying with the victims, learns the tactics of the perpetrators, which I just find, I don't know if there's a strong enough word for how I view that.
So look over the next 50 years, or the last 10 years, it does not look to me like the progress on with respect to attitudes toward Muslims is parallel to what we saw. Maybe you're more optimistic, maybe there are other things that are going to be happening. And I wonder why it's different. And another way to look at that, again, struck by something you said in your book, is the notion that many people think of an entire religion based on the acts of a very small minority with respect to Islam. But, for example, when you look at all of the problems involving clerical molestation, for example, we don't see the same kind of attribution to an entire religion based on the acts
Right.
of a very small number.
Right.
Why is that?
The reason is actually very simple, I think. It's because we know other things about Catholics, right? So if you have 100 examples of your daughter's basketball coach being a Catholic person, and the person who runs the after-school program you send your kids to being Catholic, and the school you grew up in is Catholic, right? You have 99 data points already about who Catholics are, what they stand for, what they do for the society, and then the data point that is terrible you view as an exception. There was a huge vacuum of knowledge about Muslims in America until 9/11. And the person who defined Islam for much of America on that day was Osama bin Laden. And of course, there's been many data points along those lines since. Terrible violence in America perpetrated by a handful of Muslims, and everywhere from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the terrible violence there. So the paradigm through which many Americans see Islam is through violence and terror. Right? Add to that the fact that the al-Qaeda propaganda machine is exceptional about getting their message on the evening news, and the industry of Islamophobia in America is very good at saying, yes, that in fact is Islam, and it's pretty obvious why we would have that view. So the solution to it is relatively obvious as well, which is the more appreciative knowledge we have about another tradition, the more positive, meaningful relationships we have with, frankly, mainstream and normal people within that tradition, the more we recognize that exceptional violence is just that. It's an exception. And I think the Catholic case, in a way, proves this science. Catholics are the most favorably viewed religious community in America in surveys done at the height of the clerical molestation crisis, which is stunning given how prominent the clerical molestation crisis was and how deep anti-Catholic prejudice has been in American history. Why did they still get viewed so favorably? It's because people know other things about Catholics.
Is it right that a higher percentage of, or that the states where anti-Sharia law legislation is most, preferred or a prominent issue, or where there are actually the fewest Muslims?
Right. Well, Oklahoma is a case in point in this. I mean, I think there's 30,000 Muslims in Oklahoma. Somebody tell me how they're going to implement Sharia law. And the Muslims in Oklahoma were like, we don't want Sharia law in Oklahoma. We like Oklahoma law just fine.
a very large section of this book is devoted to the role of evangelicals in the United States with respect to this issue of tolerance. Want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think, so evangelicals, including the center of the evangelical movement, Billy Graham, played a key role in trying to present John Kennedy in 1959 and 1960 as the coming of papal control of America, right? And 50 years later, evangelicals are amongst the strongest supporters of Catholic candidates, Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum amongst them, right? 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholics with significant evangelical backing. So there's been an unbelievable shift, frankly, about evangelical attitudes around Catholics. I think the cynical view of this would say that, well, here's a community that simply needs an enemy, and now the enemy is Islam. For me, as kind of a perpetual optimist, my more hopeful view is that evangelicals, like any community, changes. And they had a dramatic change around Catholics. They frankly had dramatic changes around racial issues, around AIDS. And I am seeing the beginnings of a shift around Muslims, which I think is extremely hopeful. So just to give one example, I tell the story of Bob Roberts, who's this Southern Baptist preacher right outside of Dallas, Texas, not the most obvious place for an evangelical friend of Muslims. And he's the guy who's tweeting out during the Ground Zero Mosque madness, 10 things I admire about Islam, 10 things I like about Muslims, right? And we're talking about a community, evangelicals, that's 1/3 to 40% of America, depending on whose statistics you believe. It's a community that I think Muslims, and frankly those of us who believe deeply in American pluralism, ought to be looking at as a leader in building an American pluralism as opposed to the opponents of it.
There's also much of the book that I would describe really as a guide to what works and what doesn't work. You talk about the science of interfaith relations, the art of building leaders in this community. Just tell us a little bit, what in your experience does work and what doesn't, and how do you cultivate leaders for this cause?
So, I think any field worth its salt is asking questions about its effectiveness. You see this in poverty alleviation, you see this in education reform, you see this in environmental issues, which is basically what works and how do we do more of that. And as somebody who's been involved in interfaith work for 15 years, I am sad to say this, it's a conversation that almost never happens within our circles, which is one of the reasons I'm so thrilled that Merrill and the Justice and Society program is creating a space at Aspen to ask these questions. What works in the area of building interfaith cooperation and religious pluralism? The nice thing, Elliot, is that we don't have to just rely on my personal experience over the last 10 or 15 years. There's been quite a bit of social science research done on religious diversity. Robert Putnam and David Campbell's American Grace is probably the most important work written in the last 20 years. But Pew and Gallup surveys give us a sense of what works in this area. And at IFYC, we've combed through a lot of this research and we've boiled it down to something very simple. We call it the interfaith triangle. The 3 sides being attitudes, knowledge, and relationships. And what we know works is if you have a positive and meaningful relationship with somebody from a different community, your attitudes towards that whole community improve. If you have appreciative knowledge of another tradition, your attitudes towards that tradition improve. So interfaith programs that work are ones that facilitate positive, meaningful relationships and advance appreciative knowledge. Now, this sounds totally obvious, right? And it is, except for the fact that probably half the invites I get to interfaith programs are of the nature, we're choosing the 2 most fiery preachers we could find from different religions and the most divisive issue we can think of, and we're going to have them talk about it on the stage. And then people are surprised when the audience walks out and says, gosh, those people are even worse than I thought, right? Instead of, we're going to choose a common ground issue, and we're going to choose leaders and panelists who are able to articulate in an appreciative and beautiful manner how their tradition speaks to those, and people are going to walk out saying, gosh, I never met a Baha'i before, and I'm really glad I had that conversation with Dan today, or I didn't know I never knew about engaged Buddhism, but it's something that I'm learning to admire deeply in that tradition. Right? So I think like ed reform, like poverty alleviation, you find what works and you do more of it. And after the madness of the Ground Zero Mosque discourse we had 2 years ago, I just don't think you can do good interfaith work in America or anywhere else without engaging the social science research and indexing high in effectiveness.
Eboo, let's talk for a minute just about the very notion of interfaith. You spend a lot of time with young people, you've spent a lot of time on colleges, and we'll talk about that maybe separately. One of the largest growing segments of the young population in this country are young people of no faith. And I wonder to what degree that is an issue, or how you think about that, and whether there are special problems or challenges by having a program that is so much based on people of one faith understanding another faith, as opposed to people who may not be involved in organized religion.
I think that's a hugely important question, and I think it's a question that is similar to the evangelical question, which is how do you involve a group of people who has historically, and for good reason, frankly, had a suspicion about this work, about interfaith work. One group is evangelicals, another group is the religious nuns. Just a couple of data points on this. 19% of America calls themselves religiously unaffiliated, which is the highest in our history, and a third of young people between the ages of 18 to 29, I think, call themselves religiously unaffiliated, also the highest in our history. So a couple things about how we do our work at Interfaith Youth Corps. One is not only are those people included, but they have a seat at the table just like anybody else does. And this isn't because I had such a capacious imagination when I began the organization. It's because so many bright, talented young leaders walked into our programs. Lauren Marino knows this because she worked at IFYC. Walked into our programs and said, I'm not religious. How do I get involved? And finally even I wake up and I'm like, well, you're involved like anybody else is involved. And if you're committed to building bridges between people who orient around religion differently, which is our new language for this, right? And one of the ways of orienting around religion is to be a Muslim. Another way is to be an evangelical. And a third way is to say, I'm not part of organized religion at all. If what we are doing is trying to create effective leaders who can build bridges between those various identities and communities. One such community is the religious nuns. And Robbie Jones here in DC has done important research on saying this is actually a community, right? And there's a group that are pretty explicit atheists. There's a group that are kind of spiritual seekers. There's a group that's moving out of affiliation but might well move back in. So and there are traditions associated with this. Secular humanism is a tradition with texts, with heroes, with important moments in history. So to invite people who are Hindu to articulate what's inspiring to them from their tradition to build interfaith cooperation, and to invite people who are humanists to do the same is what we've learned how to do at the organization.
I mentioned colleges, and I know from your travel you spent a lot of time on colleges. And it's interesting, there's an afterword in the book by Martin Marty talking about how colleges are particularly important venues for this message. And why is that, and how do you approach your college work?
So I think colleges do at least four things in our society. One is obviously they advance a knowledge base through research and publications. The second is that they set civic priorities, and my best example for that is multiculturalism. When I went through high school, I read not a single non-white writer in the English curriculum. I promise you at my high school that's different now. Why? Because colleges multiculturalize the American canon, and that set a priority for other institutions like high schools to do it as well. Colleges have set a civic priority on service learning, for example, and now you can't get into college without doing some volunteering in high school. A third area is that colleges are mini civil societies. So 35,000 people at the University of Illinois with its own staff, et cetera, they're like a city. Right? They can model things themselves. And finally, and obviously, colleges nurture a society's leaders. So you take those four things together, the knowledge base, the setting of civic priorities, the mini civil society, and the modeling and the nurturing of leaders, and you think to yourself, gosh, if we can get America's 2,800 four-year college campuses to take interfaith cooperation seriously, to advance a publishing and research agenda on this, to articulate it not just as a priority for for its sector, but as a priority for the broader society, to model it internally, right, to make sure that the Muslim group, the Jewish group, the atheist group, the Hindu group, the Baha'i group, the Sikh group are involved in interfaith service projects together at the University of Miami or at George Washington or at Georgetown, and then to be launching into the society a critical mass of leaders who have absorbed that knowledge base and framework and skill set in college and had some practice in leading those kinds of projects, and now send them out from everywhere, from Hollywood to hedge funds to hospitals to do that in the rest of the society. That's kind of our theory of change at Interfaith Youth Corps.
Eboo, to what degree is it fair to say that the problem is not between attitudes of people of one faith versus people of another faith, but between moderates of all faiths or no faith at all and fundamentalists of one faith?
So, the social science data on that proves that out a little bit. Again, Putnam and Campbell's American Grace, says that 50 years ago, the divides in America were between religious community, and now they're between political orientations in which people of different religious intensities revolve around, right? So the polls are religious people who orient around kind of a political and theological conservatism, who are from a range of religions on the one hand, and people who orient around a political and social progressivism, who are who are less religiously intense and also secular humanists. And I think a version of that is probably true worldwide. My sense is that this idea of it's moderates versus extremists is simplified. It's useful to a point, and then after that point, it just becomes a little bit too simplistic. And the reason we know that is because there are actually very, very different views that some religious groups have about other religious groups.
And also the whole notion of moderate Muslims is a loaded concept.
Well, I say in the book that, we Muslims raised a big hue and cry about, the term moderate Muslim between 2001 and 2010, especially the Bush administration's use of that. But by the time the Ground Zero Mosque madness rolled around, man, we wanted that term back. By all means, call me a moderate Muslim. I mean, this is not going to make me too popular amongst some segments of the Muslim community, but I'm happy with the label, and not just in its role in political discourse. I think it's Quranic, right? The Quran says that Muslims were made to be a community in the middle. So if that gets translated in political discourse as moderate, I'm fine with it. I view the center of Islam as exactly being a community in the middle. There's a great story about the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, presented with 3 drinks, wine, water, and milk, and he drank the milk, right? In my view, that's a beautiful metonym of moderation.
Well, let's talk about moderation or the lack of moderation in a different context. And I wonder, with the rise of Salafist parties in much of the Middle East, we've just been reading about it in Tunisia, we see it in Egypt, we see it in many other countries. And what Americans, leave aside the implication in those countries, what about the implication about attitudes in this country as Americans read more and more about populations of Salafists who in fact do want Sharia law, who in fact do want women in very different kinds of roles and positions? Are you concerned about a spillover effect in terms of your important work?
I mean, I'm first of all, as a Muslim and as a human being, I'm concerned about what I would call a politically aggressive Salafism. These are people who aggressive, and there are multiple types of Salafis. Salafi could be viewed as the religious right, if you will, of Islam. And there are versions of it which say we simply want to be able to practice an orthodoxy that we believe is the true vision of Islam, which I think is their right. They can, if they seek to do that, they're perfectly free to do that. What I don't think Salafists are free to do is to destroy Sufi shrines that other Muslims pray at, including the majority of South Asian Muslims, right? And no small number of Middle Eastern Muslims and Indonesian Muslims and African Muslims as well. So, a politically and socially aggressive Salafism is dangerous to everybody, first and foremost to other Muslims. I mean, these are people who will beat up Muslim pilgrims to Sufi shrines in Tunisia, which we just read about in the front page of the New York Times 2 days ago. Clearly, that's dangerous to Muslims. Most Muslims of whom have some sort of Sufi orientation, right? There are strains of Sufism that run through huge segments of the Muslim community around the world, and politically and socially aggressive Salafists seek to destroy that. That's not a good thing.
One last question, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. The Cairo speech president was just reelected. What, with respect to building bridges to the Muslim community in this country and internationally, what did he achieve? What were his accomplishments? Where did he fall down? And what does he need to do in this next term?
Thank you. I imagine this is there are how many rooms in this town? Did that question just get asked in? 10,000? With 9,999 people smarter than me answering that question right now. So I'll just say a few words. I just reread the Cairo speech on the way over here today. It's beautiful, right? And a huge part of the beauty of it is this sense that the President of the United States knows something about Islam and appreciates it. He talks about hearing the adhan at dawn and at dusk, the Muslim call to prayer in Indonesia. He talks about his admiration for Muhammad Ali, right? The iconic sports figure of the American 20th century, also a Muslim, right? He talks about Muslim contributions to global civilization. He talks about the Muslims who serve in his administration. I think simply articulating a knowledge and appreciation of a tradition that's 1,400 years old, that has 1.5 billion people, is a very, very important thing. Clearly, there are policy dimensions to this as well. But I think changing the tone is no small thing, and I think Barack Obama has done that, and I think that he will continue to do that. And let me just say, if you know, I'm, in my role at Interfaith Youth Corps, we are not a political organization. In my private life, I would say that I'm a moderate Democrat. I think Mitt Romney would likely have done much the same. Right? Mitt Romney grows up in Michigan around a number of Muslims. He makes positive statements about Muslims, even when his fellow Republican primary candidates are making negative statements. I think he ought to be lauded for that. I think that he would have probably carried on some of the same tone. I do think that a man whose father was Kenyan and mother was Kansan and who grew up in Hawaii and Indonesia, when he says it, it makes a difference. And I hope Barack Obama keeps on saying those things.
Can I make a, just,
Please.
I think as Eboo, since you serve on the outgrowth of one of the major outgrowths of the President's Cairo speech is the Partners for New Beginning, and that was meant to tether a number of action items from that speech. One, he appointed a science envoy, which speaks to what you just said in terms of the richness of what the region has contributed to. Our own public-private partnership is meant to do the day-to-day work to try to deepen that outreach on the ground. And there is so much more that is needs to be pursued, but I think what's not talked about often enough is what has been tethered in terms of real deliverables that is part of that Cairo speech, and that needs to be talked about more.
Right. So let me thank you for that, Tony. Let me say one more word on that. One of the things, as a Chicagoan and somebody who was on a presidential advisory council and has come to D.C. With some regularity during the Obama administration, one of the things I've learned is that a huge thing that presidential speeches do is give guidance to his own or her own administration, right? And in this case, I find it part of the American genius that the guidance doesn't just take root. The guidance in this case being we need to have stronger and more positive bridges between America and majority Muslim nations. The guidance doesn't just take place in USAID or the State Department, kind of the obvious places. It takes place in the American private sector and civil society as well, which I think is part of the genius of America, is that our government is proactive in building these public-private partnerships. And part of what President Obama wanted and what PNB, I think, carries out with brilliance is how do we bring the fullness of the American genius. It's NGOs, it's companies, and its government figures in partnership with Muslim countries. And so you've got, huge water projects led by Coca-Cola in partnership with these countries. You've got entrepreneurial projects, social entrepreneurship projects being run. We're doing a lot of work in terms of nurturing interfaith leaders. And I love that Obama sees these bridges as not just being government to government, State Department to foreign ministry, but company to company, NGO to NGO.
Our first question is from my colleague, Dan Glickman, and then...
First of all, I'm delighted that I came here. It's fascinating. You mentioned Hollywood. I spent a fair number of years in the entertainment world. The most popular show on television now is Homeland. I don't know how many of you watch it here, Showtime. It is a, do you know what I'm talking about?
I do, although with the 5-year-old and the 2-year-old, the most popular show in my house is Diego.
Okay, well, when you get to be my age, you don't watch those other shows. But anyway, so Homeland is this very, very well-watched, high-rated, won all the Emmys last year about a group of Islamic terrorists. And it always struck me that if you really wanted to begin to tackle these problems, you had to go into the world of culture. Mm-hmm. You had to go into movies, TV, books, music, and I'd say that very little progress has been made in this area today. There are a few television shows that are involved with it, but when this show is the dominant show that gets all the awards and everything else, and it's a very good show, and not every character is painted with this linear view, but most are. It sure doesn't inspire you to want to go out and love your neighbor after you watch it.
So thank you for that. Couple of comments on that. If American Muslims had one award to give in the next 10 years and to go to a cultural figure, that figure would be Jon Stewart, right? Jon Stewart has done the smartest, the funniest, the best stuff about Muslims in America that other than Bloomberg, who was obviously a political figure. So I think that he's this secular Jewish guy who goes to work on the high holy days, has been in the corner of American pluralism, taking on its enemies and supporting one of its highest level victim groups in the last few years, which is American Muslims. I would also say that Muslim culture stuff is happening, right? So there are a growing group of Muslim writers. There's DC's own Wajahat Ali, who's done a bunch of stuff for the Aspen Institute, who's a great playwright and humorist. There have been a couple of sitcoms that didn't quite make it, Aliens in America. So, but I have no doubt that something will stick. I don't know if it will be Cosby Show level sticking, but there are enough 20-something Muslims who are busy doing smart stuff. Ayat Akhtar's book, American Dervish, I think is a positive step in this direction. He's got a play right now in New York. It's not that this is escaping us. It's just that the culture world is a tough place to compete and win.
Okay, when you have questions, if you could turn on your microphone by pushing the red button, and for those of the people in the back, if you could just come up and borrow a microphone, because this is being filmed and we want to make sure. Oh, we do have a microphone. Terrific. So if you're in the back, we can bring you a microphone. In the corner and then over here. Please, yes.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. I'm interested more if you would talk further about the Salafism and what do you project that we can counter it, and in what ways? I mean, internally, can the Muslims themselves work with their other factions to come together? How do we do this? Not somebody from the outside doing it.
So I mean, honestly, I don't know, and my knowledge of Salafism is, not graduate school level knowledge. It's reading the New York Times and Foreign Affairs like you all do, and it's because I'm a Muslim with a significant Sufi orientation. And so, when Sufi shrines and the companions and family of the Prophet Muhammad have their graves destroyed in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, I am deeply distressed about that, right? So when I go back to India, it's Sufi shrines that I go to. When I go to Turkey, it's Rumi's tomb that I go to. And I am amongst the majority of Muslims who do this, right? But I think that, and I want to reiterate, there are many strands of Salafism. There's an Amish-oriented Salafism, which is of no threat to anybody else. It's simply an internal insular community. And then there are political and socially aggressive Salafisms, and I think there's simply no doubt but that it's a big problem and a larger threat to Muslims than to anybody else.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think a man who could be fairly termed as a tycoon of the Islamophobia industry, Alan West, he's still fighting, conceding his election loss in Florida. With this shift that we're seeing in one of these big figures who really does speak to the Islamophobia industry moving out of the political sphere and this repudiation, the question comes to mind of how can we lessen Islamophobia in the political sphere, make it less politically valuable as capital, and how much is that really a stumbling block towards creating more civil society engagement between Americans and the Muslim world internationally?
So thank you for that. There were like 5 complex questions there. I'm trying to think of which one's the easiest so that I can answer that. So a big part of what Sacred Ground is it's I view it as kind of my song to American pluralism. And I think the first thing to do is to say the heart of America is a nation that welcomes the contributions of all communities and nurtures cooperation between them. Right? That's what America is about. And it's been about that from before the founding. You mentioned Peter Stuyvesant in the 1650s, the governor general of what was then New Amsterdam, bans Quaker prayer meetings, while a group of ordinary citizens and a couple of minor officials in the hamlet of Flushing, Queens, writes the Flushing Remonstrance in response to that and says the law of peace, love, and liberty should extend to all, Jew, Turk, and Egyptian, as they are all children of the same God. Right? So the dynamic that I talk about in the Sacred Ground, which is the forces of prejudice meeting and defeating the forces of prejudice, the forces of pluralism engaging and defeating the forces of prejudice, I think is a glorious narrative in America, and we need to write the next chapter in that right now. Right? But the first thing to do is to say, basically, to say to the Alan Wests and the Newt Gingriches circa 2010 and the Pam Gellers, this is un-American. It's anti-American. When you say that a certain community doesn't belong here, that it can't build its version of a YMCA here, you are going against what is the American genius. Let me say one other quick thing about this, especially vis-a-vis what Tony does with PNB. Robert Putnam, the great Harvard social scientist, he says at the beginning of a speech he gave some years ago that the one thing that we know about societies a generation from now is that they're going to be more diverse than they are today, right? So societies all over the world, from Europe to Iran to Afghanistan, are highly internally diverse. And we spend a lot of time asking the question, is Egypt going to be able to build a representative government? Is Afghanistan going to be able to build a state that is able to govern and police the length and breadth of the country, right? We spend a lot of time asking, are the 22-year-olds in Egypt going to have jobs? I would say a question that is equally important is, are the Christians and the Muslims in Egypt going to be able to build a nation together? Are the Sufi-oriented Tunisians and the Salafi-oriented Tunisians going to be able to build a nation together? Are the Sunnis and Shias of Bahrain going to be able to build a nation together? Meaning that the communal and sectarian questions in Muslim-majority countries are, in my view, amongst the top 3 questions we have to ask as they transition. America's the nation with the longest, largely positive history in this regard. And I think that this is not the time for the Alan Wests and Pam Gellers to be shrilly speaking on TV that some groups don't belong. This is the time for America to be America and to model to the world that people from different religious orientations and backgrounds can indeed build a nation together.
Eboo, I've got a question for you. So you've spoken very admirably about the American tradition of tolerance. And when you talk about the Islam of America, the Judaism of America, the Christianity of America, you're talking a lot about moderation and tolerance. And these are American concepts. What happens when your tolerance and my tolerance bumps up against, as you describe, a more intolerant and extreme version of whatever faith? And are we able to say we are building in America uniquely American versions of religious faith?
Yeah. What a religious faith or religious pluralism?
individual faith and
Yeah.
pluralism to work together.
Okay, that's a really important and smart question. Give me a second. So let me say, I think America as a nation state has a distinct and powerful tradition of pluralism, right? So I'll give you a very quick example of this. In 1790, George Washington receives, in some versions, a letter, in other versions, a personal meeting with a Jewish figure named Moses Sessions. And Sessions is concerned about the fate of Jews in the new nation because he knows well what's happened to Jews elsewhere for many centuries. And Washington responds to Sessions's question about the fate of Jews in America with a letter called a letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, which for my money belongs with the Great American Documents, right? And he says, America will give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. Okay, so that is what I call a national tradition of pluralism in America, is that America's founders, Jefferson owned a Quran, hosted the first iftar at the White House. Benjamin Franklin built a hall in Philadelphia and said that the pulpit of this hall will be open to any preacher, including somebody preaching Islam sent by the Mufti of Constantinople, right? Our first set of national leaders put a stake in the ground, not just for freedom of religion, but for pluralism, which is to say positive relations between people from different religious communities. I think that every civilization has strains and strands of pluralism. The question is, do different nation states have that within their history as a nation state? Now, as a set of Muslim-majority countries are becoming new nation states, meaning that they're transitioning in forms of government, they're going to have to look into, I think, their civilizational past for the high point moments in pluralism and say we're putting those into practice in the new Egypt, in the new Syria, in the et cetera, et cetera. And what will be a different Bahrain probably in 25 or 30 years. I think that the articulation of the heritage of a civilization or a nation in orienting its future is very important, right? And we are really lucky in America to have a treasure within our heritage for pluralism. I think there were two more things that you asked. Let me separate them. Do I think American religions are unique? I think the answer to that is probably yes, and here's why. We in America, and this is remarkable, right? We don't view loyalty to a different identity as treason. We don't view Catholic loyalty to the Pope as dangerous or treasonous. We don't view Jewish loyalty to whether it's the Torah or to a kinship with Israel as dangerous or treasonous. We welcome people's different identities and actually have created ways of mixed identities that are what I would call mutually enriching, right? So the metaphor of the hyphen between African and American or Catholic and American, it's not a barrier, it's a bridge. And there are plenty of other nations that view loyalties to other identities as treason. The way that that's contributed to America is that people take the inspiration they get from their various racial, ethnic, religious identities and heritages. They plant them in American soil and they grow into institutions that serve the common good. And this is not just a metaphor. Let's just take the Catholic case. There are 600 Catholic hospitals in America. They serve 85 million patients a year. American healthcare is unimaginable without them. 85 million patients a year is over a quarter of the country. Right? There are 230 Catholic colleges. There are 7,000 Catholic elementary and grade schools. Urban school systems are unimaginable and frankly unviable without the presence of a significant number of Catholic schools that educate a significant number of students, over half of whom in places like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia are not Catholic, many of whom are from challenging socioeconomic backgrounds. A terrific example of how the Catholic faith has rooted itself in America, become a different kind of Catholicism, and dramatically strengthened the American tradition. And I think that that's the genius of American pluralism, right? The promise of America, I'll repeat, is that all of these communities have their dignity, have their equality, are able to express. But America is not fundamentally about 100 separate tribes. It's fundamentally one nation, and those different communities contribute their efforts to building a single nation. And the more I think about it, the more I realize just how genius that is, and just how important a model that is for other nations that are struggling with their own diversity. That doesn't mean they're going to look like America, but that means that at some point Iran is going to have to figure out what to do with its Azeris, and marginalizing them is not an option. Saudi Arabia is going to figure out what to do with its Shias, and marginalizing them is not an option. Pakistan is going to have to figure out what to do with its Balukis, and marginalizing them is not an option, right? How do you deal with that? Well, you construct a way of being Pakistani or Iranian or Saudi in which you can be proud of being Shia and express that in ways that build the broader nation.
Over here. Just push your button on the, thank you. It's the red button and the.
It doesn't change your idea, but what about the know-nothings in the 1800s, Catholics overcoming
Yeah.
that? One, and then two, you mentioned first of all, there were also Muslims who came here in the 1700s. Even people came as slaves. They were illiterate from Madagascar and whatever. They were Muslim. And then secondly, you mentioned the black Muslims here. And is there any kind of commonality that you can reach out to them? So it's two things, the know-nothing, how does that fit?
So
And then
actually, the Know Nothing, I actually write some about the Know Nothing Party in Sacred Ground. This was the party in the 1850s largely who the single plank in their platform was Catholics don't belong in America. In 1850, 1852, they elected 75 people to the U.S. Congress. Entire state legislatures, including in Massachusetts, were full of Know Nothing people. In fact, Know Nothing candidates would win even when they weren't on the ballot. They would win in write-in votes, right? The entire platform was Catholics don't belong. Part of what I write in Sacred Ground is, what if the Know Nothings had won, right? What would American healthcare look like without its Catholic hospitals? What would American education look like without its Catholic schools and universities? And this is, I think, for me, it affirms 2 points. One is the forces of pluralism have defeated the forces of prejudice before, and amongst the people who stood up to the Know Nothing Party was Abraham Lincoln, right? So it's part of that dynamic of the forces of pluralism engaging and defeating the forces of prejudice. And the second thing is a huge challenge and opportunity for Muslims in America is to build what I call big tent Islam, which is diverse ethnically, racially, based on national origin, based on theological orientation, based on Sunni and Shia. It is all of those things. And you can have your disagreements, as people ought to have, but one group does not denounce another group out of the tent, right? A big tent Islam. And there's a greater diversity of Muslims in America than at any other place on the planet except for Hajj, meaning the time when Muslims from all over the world gather for the pilgrimage to Mecca. That is a remarkable opportunity. Now, here's where it can go deeply wrong, is a balkanization of Muslims in America and internal tension. Where I think it can go right is what Catholics did. 100 years ago, you had Irish Catholicism, Italian Catholicism, German Catholicism, etc., and there were deep internal tensions between those communities. Now you have an American Catholicism, which is still proud of its various heritages, but doesn't denounce people out of the tent based on national or ethnic origin. I think we need to move in that direction when it comes to Islam, and I think that African American Muslims are leaders in this, and I'll just give a single example of this. It is probably the case that if you were to name the 10 most prominent Muslims in America, 8 or 9 of them would be of African American. Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to Congress from Minnesota. Speaking of culture, Mos Def, the hip-hop artist, recently changed his name to Yasin. Dave Chappelle, the comedian. These are African-American Muslims. The athletes, from Hakeem Olajuwon to Muhammad Ali, these are African-American Muslims, right? And if you think about it, this makes sense. Their fluency in America goes 400 years deep, and their connection to Islam is just as deep and authentic. So it would make sense that they would rise to the top of kind of prominence in terms of American Muslim figures.
Yes, if you could wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Eboo, thank you for your comments and thoughts. I had a question about what you envision would be the reaction of America, if there were another attack like 9/11, the magnitude of 9/11, do you think we have traveled far since the original 9/11 attacks that you would see something different, and why?
Thank you for that question. So I would say I'm going to repeat, I think the great genius of America is our civil society, right? And when a problem emerges, whether it's a problem of violence or a problem of prejudice, American civil society goes into motion to engage it positively. And I think we're sitting in a great example of this, right? My guess is 15 years ago, the Aspen Institute had nary a program on religious pluralism. And now there's probably versions of a half dozen, two of the most prominent being here with us. We recognize there's to explain that a little bit, when the challenges of religious tension, violence, intolerance come to the fore, American civic institutions go into action to engage that, from public libraries to universities to think tanks like the Aspen Institute. So now that we know that there is a problem, I think that the number of actors, especially in our civil society, but also in the private sector and in the government, are better at responding to those things, are quicker to responding to those things. And I think the Muslim community in America is much quicker as well. I'll never forget a day or two after 9/11, I was watching TV, and an anchor person asked a Muslim leader, what are you doing to help with the healing efforts after 9/11? And the Muslim leader had no answer. And I looked at the TV and I'm like, are you kidding me? You don't have an answer to this question, right? Either rhetorically or in substance, I promise you that wouldn't happen right now. I promise you that if something ugly happened in America, any Muslim you would see on TV would say, within an hour of us learning about this, these are the things our community started doing, and I'm on TV, and I'm here to tell you about that. And by the way, we're working with humanists and Hindus and Christians and Jews in these efforts to heal our nation. 10 years ago, American Muslims didn't have that at the tip of their tongue, and frankly, they didn't have much of it in their institutions at all.
What about the attack on the Gujarat? Maybe Manjit knows it.
Maybe Manjit can respond to you in terms of the reaction
Yeah.
in terms of the attack on the Gurdwara. Have you been satisfied with the response?
Well, I think overall the response was very positive, not only within the state of Wisconsin, but also nationwide. So I think definitely things have changed since 9/11, but I was wondering how much of that change has been more in larger metro cities and not as much in the kind of heartland of America. And that's what I was trying to allude to, is that I think there's still a lot of work to be done when you go inside the heartlands. Both the coasts are very diverse, and there is less issues on the east and west coast. But as you travel into the heartland, we see there is still a lot of prejudice and intolerance and bigotry.
I was just in Milwaukee, and I was just with some of the Sikhs who, in fact, the son of the man who was president of that temple. I just want to say my thoughts and prayers, and my heart is with you and your community. What a terrible incident to have to endure. And those last 10 years of anti-Sikh violence, it's terrible. And again, my thoughts and prayers and heart is with you. And one of the things that encouraged me was the level of positive response by the Milwaukee community to that temple. And so I think that, generally speaking, you are right in that the coasts the diversity is more present and people feel more conversant in it. But I think one of the things about the heartland, from somebody who lives in Chicago and who travels across the Midwest an awful lot to small towns, especially where college campuses are, is the civil society there moves very, very quickly. So something really terrible happens 15 miles south of Milwaukee, and that whole greater Milwaukee community, its libraries, its universities, its schools, its teacher training programs, its police departments, it starts to move very quickly to surround in a positive and hospitable way the affected community and to create changes. Yes, please.
I would like to make more of a common observation. Obviously, over the past 300 years, many of our ancestors came from European countries to seek religious freedom. And, but what it appears to me now, and I just came back from a trip to Germany, is that Europe, the European Union, may not have learned that much, although it's looking for guidance from the United States. The struggle over the last 3-4 years or so concerning admission of Turkey into the European Union has been an issue because of the Islamic religion. And I vividly recall a German politician who was speaking in DC a couple years ago, and he was asked about that subject, and he said, well, unfortunately, that nation has the wrong religion. And for me to hear that, especially from a German politician, was not, gave me sort of the chills. What is it? Is there any dialogue with Europe on this issue? Because obviously it's, especially with the situation with Turkey right now, the phases we are in, the struggles that Turkey has, being a multi-religious country with very strong factions on either side. And is there anything that Europe could learn from the United States, and or is a dialogue that's possible or should be initiated?
So as somebody, I've spent a reasonable number of the last 6 or 8 years involved in, I would say, in some version of that, right? Conversations between American officials and civil society leaders and European officials and civil society leaders. And I think that the challenge of religious identity, diversity, and nation states in Europe is frankly far more acute than here in the United States for I would say 2 major reasons. One is the population of Muslims that came to America, and I'm talking about the immigrant Muslims right now, came largely came with master's degrees, right, after 1965, and took up positions of influence and affluence in America, right? And this was as a result of the 1965 Immigration Act that effectively only let you in if you were some version of a doctor or an engineer. So the population that's here takes its place at a very different level of American society, which is why, Sheikh Hamza will frequently say, everybody in America knows a Muslim, it's their doctor. And that's actually, it's a joke, but it's also true, And the population the population that came to Europe came, first of all, from places that had just gotten rid of colonialism with its range of attitudes and dispositions, et cetera, came as laborers, were to unfriendly places without a national identity of an immigrant nation. Our national identity, that we are a nation that welcomes people from different backgrounds, is so hugely important, because you look at new populations, and yes, there's xenophobia and prejudice and nativism, et cetera, in America, but the louder song, if you will, is those are new Americans. Those Muslims are new Americans. Those Latinos are new Americans. My great-grandfather came off a boat from Poland or from Germany. My great-grandfather was Irish, right? So there's a national mindset which says, welcome those folks in, right? That doesn't exist. That story, that history is much, much different in nations whose very names have an ethnic heritage at the center. There's an ethnicity called Spanish. There's an ethnicity called French. Right? So there is a sense of outsiderness when you arrive, and especially when you arrive from a country that just shook off the shackles of colonialism, and you arrive with very little English, working in a factory that 15 years later closes. That's a challenge for Europe.
I think I've probably been accused of putting too much of my hopes in the new generation, like generational differences. I apologize for anyone that might be. But looking at, my generation or younger people, it seems like there's a lot less of this Islamophobia, even among people that look to be going towards leadership in these areas. So I look at the Allen Wests and the Newt Gingriches, and it seems like they're going to almost naturally disappear over time. Not that there isn't a lot of work to do now to stop that. Am I right in this assumption? I'm looking at this through a very small window, clearly.
I think you're 100%. Look, if we were to bring John Kennedy back and say, hey, the strongest force behind Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, Catholic candidates for president, were American evangelicals, he would say, am I on Mars? right? And that's only 50 years ago. That's not that long ago. And the classic line on Kennedy is from his wife, which is, "I can't believe they're accusing John of being Catholic," So I think that there are multiple currents of change. One is you have a bunch of 20-something-year-old Muslims who are telling their parents, actually, I'm going to go into public policy or law or media or culture, and I'm not going into medicine or engineering. Thank you for raising me in the suburbs and helping me get into an Ivy League school, but what Muslims need to be in the early 21st century is different than who we were in the 1980s, and I want to fill that. And secondly, as the election showed, America is moving towards a genuinely multicultural, multi-faith nation. And any company or civic institution or, frankly, political party that wants to be a part of that, now or in the future, I don't think expressing prejudice towards segments of your population, whether they're Muslims or gays, is a particularly good way of success.
We'll have two more questions because we do have to end at 2 o'clock. Right here, and then the last question over here. Why don't you actually both give your questions, and then we'll have Eboo respond to both. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Barbara Cheragino. It doesn't seem to me that it's really very productive to talk about generational differences. I mean, I'm from essentially the hippie generation, and I think openness to all kinds of things, including different peoples, was a big part of the hippie generation. So certainly won't take that much offense, but honestly, I haven't changed so much as I've gotten older, and I've learned more, but even in that day, it was a kind of a openness to our generation that I don't think you really need to forget.
Thank you for that. And
my question, Eboo, builds on your point about there not being too many other data points for people to have as a reference when they see some despicable or unrepresentative acts of a small group. Is there some way that, and this always happens when we see stuff, bad things happen, they put on TV some guy who's a moderate, who's usually a university professor or something like that, and then they'll put some guy on the other side to give fair and balanced approaches, as opposed to, a broader discussion that provides data points. And in this world of social media and polling, which you just went through, I think it'd be interesting to figure out a way to have the moderate Muslim community, now that phrase is acceptable, speak up and provide a voice that sort of accepts or rejects, hopefully rejects most of the objectionable things that happen around the world, as opposed to no voice, but some professors saying, this is just the work of some extremists. If a Pew or Gallup poll, some version of it, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, whatever, comes out and says, look, 95% of Muslims in America thinks this is ridiculous and unrepresentative.
So I thank you for that. I think that's a very important point. A couple things on that. I know that this is our closing here also. The only time Muslims should be on TV is not when they are saying terrorism is not part of my religion. Okay, part of the fault of that, the main fault of that, is terrorists who call themselves Muslim, who commit acts of terrorism and then get them on television. A second fault of that, I would say, is American Muslims. There was a vacuum of knowledge about Islam before 9/11 in America. Why were we not, as a community, articulating who we were, a self-understanding of Muslims and Islam? The reason that vacuum existed is precisely because we hadn't articulated what we thought was a view of Islam that could be attractive. We were there. You could say there are natural reasons for this. We were building our private institutions, etc. But we're also a part of a broader society, a society that frankly welcomed us in with its various freedoms and privileges. And I think part of our responsibility to that society is to articulate an appreciative understanding of who we are. So maybe this sounds too harsh, but in my view, the vacuum existed because we left a vacuum, and that is our fault, right? having said that, we're in the situation that we're in, and the most important thing that Muslims in America can do now is to make civic contributions to this nation. There still isn't a Muslim hospital in America, but there are Jewish and Catholic hospitals. And those types of things, and they're not going to start at the $50 million or $100 million level. They're going to start at the smaller level, but we need to be viewed as a community that is making contributions to this country, again, because we benefit from its privileges and opportunities. I say to Muslims all the time, that Catholic school that you go to, somebody built that school, right? Another community built it. And the reason your tuition is half of what it would be at a comparable school is because somebody else is subsidizing it. When will we do that at any scale for other folks? I think that that's a deep part of Islam, this notion of maslaha, or the common good. It's also a way of being American. So I'm looking forward to the young Muslims that you talk about coming to prominence in that and doing it at a level of scale and critical mass, so that when terrible things happen in the name of Islam, you're not just looking at the university professor on TV and saying, oh, I'm glad he's explaining Al-Qaeda as an exception. You're saying, the 99 touches I have with Muslims are so counter to that ugliness, that ugliness is not only an exception, but a violation of the tradition, in the same way that people view Catholics.
Ladies and gentlemen, Eboo is going to be signing this wonderful book outside for you. I recommend it very strongly. I thank you very much for being here, Eboo.
Thank you.